don't they say it's been the warmest, or is it longest period of sunshine we've had for a May on record? But a bit of yeah, it is. Some people are nodding, but a bit of welcome rain, perhaps, for those people in agriculture. What? Oh yeah. I have Paul Draper, so we've got the boss actually next door to me. He
Morning, everybody.
Morning,
I'm just a floating head.
So he's here, but he just reminded me also to say that if you're so desperate to ask a question, and if we see you on the front screen, just raise your hand. I know there is a digital hand waving button, but perhaps just wave your hand, and maybe Paul can let you in on something if we want to talk about it desperately. Before again we kick off, what I want to do today with this is we're going to keep it informal. I'm always informal with these sorts of meetings. B, it will be UK sort of orientated, so where we might have some international folk coming in, it is sort of for a UK audience what I'm talking about, and we are going to be talking about pretty much non-tunnel houses. We know tunnel ventilated houses can keep things cool in warm weather. But we're mainly going to concentrate on how things are done in the UK, and the reasons why we as Draper Ventilation and myself, when I was once upon a time with ADAS, and I'll give a little bit of my background in a second as well, do the things we do is based on scientific principles basically that have come back from many years ago. And that's really what we're aiming at today. And so it might feel a bit techy. It might feel, it's not going to be lots of lovely pictures probably of different types of chicken houses and inlets. You'll probably know many of those yourself. But what we are going to do is run through the reasons why for a broiler we ventilate the way we do, and we specify the way we do. And it's something which I think Paul and I we don't compromise on. How are we doing on folks? Because otherwise you might just have to sort of...
Yeah, got a couple more.
Got a couple more roll on.
There we go.
Are you all okay?
Yeah, no, I think let's just get cracking. They can come in and join this.
Well,
if you let everybody in, we're recording, by the way.
Oh, yes, it is. So before you swear at the TV or anything with our open mic, it is being recorded. And I'll try and avoid swearing at you as well. So it's all good. Right, okay, we'll kick off. So just as a way of introduction, I'm Justin Emery. I've been in the industry, sort of lifelong member of the industry, really, if you see what I mean. Started off with Broiler Breeders, family-ran Broiler Breeders. Not far from where, George, are you? George, not far from you, was it, actually? But hello. Yeah, so we ran a broiler breeder enterprise down in Hampshire. My father actually was involved with ADAS quite early on, and he was involved actually in one of the first Emery systems, actually, and in the good old days, ADAS had plenty of money to sort of throw at these projects. They built Emery systems in breeder houses, and he was quite early on also into sort of controlled feeding systems. But actually interesting, of course, with an Emery and a breeder, you had cockerels sort of coming at you at head height. So a lot of it was not so much that the system didn't work, it was just the danger of having a cockerel launching himself at you from head height. And that's one of the reasons that didn't go well. But background otherwise is, I did a diploma in poultry production at the SAC, I did a degree in agriculture. I did actually take a break, and it's been useful in later years, and did 5 years with the MOD as a telecommunications person for avionics, essentially. It was third line repair. So that did sort of help me with electronics. We did sort of missile guidance systems and things on helicopters and all that stuff. But then I was 15 years with ADAS, and I sort of worked up to becoming a sort of a ventilation, I suppose you can call it specialist. What is an expert? What is a specialist? But I did ventilation. I worked under people like Dr. David Charles, who was quite, he spent his life developing ventilation systems, environmental control for poultry. And in those days, of course, we had SILSO research station, didn't we? And they used to produce a huge amount of good, hard research data. Nowadays, of course, this is in the hands of companies almost like us. If we had the budget to do lots and lots of research, then we could offer things to the industry and offer you guys price, and it's something we work on. But in those days, it was done by government funding, and a lot of the principles on which we work to today were developed back then. And unfortunately, I think over the years we have I think at our peril lost a lot of those basic principles, and some of those things are what we're going to talk about today. And then we had that problem, didn't we, in 2003, where we had awful hot weather. This is sort of in the times when I met Paul, when we had that 38 degrees and a huge loss of birds in the industry. And I know Paul pretty much made it his focus that anything he ever did with ventilation thereafter was going to try and avoid that level of damage that was happened. And then last year, what did we have? Similar sort of levels of temperature and heat. I was with the Ministry of Agriculture at the time, sorry, with ADAS, and I worked with the Ministry of Agriculture during that period of time to try and produce heat stress booklets and advice to the industry going forward. And then I've joined Paul in 2011, and we've taken this thing forward where we won't compromise, because anyone who's lived through hauling out birds, in hot weather, you don't want to do it. And I think the people who take it lightly are those who probably have never experienced it, if I can generalize in such a way. I've got the next slide thing, haven't I? So, is it working still? Oh, something's happened. Technology. Yeah, can we do the, back onto the, I don't know what you guys can see at the moment. Here we go, that's what I want. Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to move on to the presentation now. So as I said, what I'm going to talk about is maximum ventilation rates, and it's going to be sort of non-tunnel houses as we go forward. One thing we can say about the UK, isn't it, is that we have had extremes of temperature. We are a climate which, on the one hand, can be cold, damp, misty, but on the other hand, it can also do extremes. We have had -18, and we have had as near as damn it 39 degrees centigrade in this country. Quite frequently, we are classified as what they call the UK Climate Zone 1. Now, I've not bothered to look into exactly what Climate Zone 1 is, but Climate Zone 1 is pretty much saying we're temperate and we're cool. And I'll show you a little slide in a minute. But that, and because of that, we don't need high ventilation rates. Now, I would disagree with that sentiment, and I think a lot of UK manufacturers disagree with that sentiment, because it doesn't matter really what we're termed as in terms of climate zone. The fact is, history has proven that we get these temperatures. The last 10 years, you've all had 30-degree plus days, and that means that there are going to be some farms out there that have had full stock of birds at that stocking rate. We also know, and history has proven, that there's an awful lot of farms that don't cope with it. We also know that the retailers and social media really don't give any of us, farmers or integrators or the industry a chance. If we get it wrong and we have pictures of mortality banded around the internet, we don't have a chance. So for all those reasons, I don't think it's acceptable just to say we are a climate zone 1. We have to operate to the peak temperatures we get. And also, there is a tendency to, let's say, work down the probability factor. The probability is that we're not going to get very hot weather because we're a temperate zone. I don't think that's almost acceptable. And actually, there's possibly even a legal sort of caveat there where, well, if I just put up a slide on, if it's decided not to, just press a button, work. Sorry, my advanced key's not working. This is great technology, isn't it? Okay, it's going down. The way the law terms heat stress, and this is where, say, coming back to this issue of probability, the fact that some people say, well, let's only give you X amount of ventilation because the probability is that you're only going to see this 1 year in 5 or 1 year in 10. The Welfare of Farmed Animal Regulations, this WOFAR 2010, broadly says, in terms of heating and ventilation, that it must be sufficient to avoid overheating. Now, it doesn't really say what overheating is. There is as you know, there is an annex that says that we must keep the birds within 30 degrees of outside, within 3 degrees of outside temperature when it's 30 degrees outside. that's a very, very woolly statement, I'm afraid, because you can put a temperature probe right in front of an inlet, and if it's 30 outside, it'll be 30 just inside that on that temperature probe, and theoretically, you have met the terms of the law. But what we're talking about is the birds overheating. So that's what we've got to try and avoid. And you can argue, does that mean then, if we look at heat stress, hopefully you can see this on the screen, I can't see any of you at the moment, but there we go. The heat stress, hope you, yes, is perhaps occurs when the birds have difficulty achieving a balance, as it says here, between body heat production and body heat loss. And this feast moves dramatically depending on how old the birds are, what the feather covering is, the humidity. There's so many things that go into that. But basically it says avoid overheating. It's a very, very deliberate, broad statement. And it's designed in principle to catch you if we do things which are not, you know, whether we sail close to the line in terms of ventilation rates, what we're giving the birds. If we knowingly do not give the birds a ventilation rate, which means they can survive peak temperatures, have we not then transgressed this rule? Okay. We'll have to do it. So very quickly, what we have in the UK, just so for folk, if you want to know, we are predominantly a maritime climate. So we have polar maritime. That basically is our predominant weather system. It comes in mostly from the northwest. We're moving cold air over warm seas, and it gives us lots of rain and occasional bits of sunshine. And you could argue very, very roughly, it's sort of around the 0 to 15 degrees mark. So pretty this much where everyone thinks of Britain as this, you know, this cloudy, horrible place, and that's what we normally have, polar maritime. Tropical maritime is the same system. It's coming in from the west. That's because the Earth is spinning in this direction, and so it sends all the stuff from America across the Atlantic across to us. The southwesterlies are where you get warm air coming over the seas, and they come over to cold seas, and then we tend to get slightly more stable weather, but it's stable, misty, overcast, etc. And it's in this sort of, yeah, the teens, sort of 10 to 20 degrees. So those are our two main systems, and that can, depending on where the jet streams go, that can be our majority weather system. So we sometimes think, yeah, because of that, there we go, we can exist in this area where we need a ventilation system that can cope with humid weather conditions. In the winter, though, we can actually get these polar continentals, these blocking high pressure systems. And if they come in from Siberia, etc., we can get, I've seen actually on a temperature gauge once on time -18, you might have seen similar sort of numbers. But it's a sort of typical temperatures where we get -18, and maybe it's crystal clear blue skies and frost during the day. But what we've been having recently, and what produces this really hot stuff that we're getting, is essentially are the tropical continent. Sorry, I've been told to stand still. Tropical continental systems. And again, it's a high pressure zone that comes up from North Africa. And this is what we've been getting, where we can get 29 up 20 degrees, perhaps, you know, up to 39 degrees. It's the reason we get it just depends how far this high pressure system wanders up over, you know, from North Africa, for example, up over the continent, and what we can get. So there's no reason why we shouldn't get high temperatures just because we're slightly further around. It just depends on how this continental high comes up over us. But that's what we get. It doesn't happen necessarily very often. It depends on the jet streams, but we can get these very, very hot temperatures. So quickly moving on then, anyway, let's get on. When we deal with birds, clearly, you know, we're an industry that needs to keep performance going. That's where we make our money. What we've got here basically is what they call phenotype, which is the bird expression. And that basically is a combination of what its genetic potential is and what its environment is. And we can see that the line along the top is its genetic potential. In principle, we very rarely or ever get to that point. The field performance is always slightly below it, but we have a combination to get that field performance, to get the phenotype. We have management, environment, health and nutrition, and all of these, of course, have got to fit in together. We're looking specifically at the environment, and we want to keep the environment as optimum as we can for this bird. What have I done now? So what we have, we're trying to build houses, for example, that can cope with the bird that we've got. And if you see this blue section in the middle, for example, I've got these lines here, these bell-shaped curves here. They are, for example, genetic performance. And let's say that we have today, where we are now is the blue curve of genetic performance. Now that says that some of those birds will cope reasonably well in the house on the left, this old thing, this old wooden houses, these old wooden houses, they'll cope and grow. The black line is perhaps the genetic performance of birds, let's say from, I don't know, 70s, 80s, 90s. They would do well if you stuck them in a garden shed. They'd grow fine, you know, because you're just not limited on the environmental conditions, particularly for them, in the same way. So we've got houses that would work very well for the older type birds. But as we move on, some of the birds would be okay in older houses, but we're going to lose our ability to get their genetic expression done because the house isn't good enough. So we've built modern houses, better insulation, better control systems, like the house in the middle, for example, a standard sort of well-insulated reach house with sidewall inlets. And that's doing a good deal of the genetics. But what we've also got to think about is the house that we're going to have birds in for the future. So what is the genetic potential going to be of the future? And will that house, or our houses which we currently build, limit those birds in the future? They'll grow, they'll carry on growing, but are we going to get the best out of them just because we haven't got a house which is up to spec for them? So what we've been trying to do, at least on the environmental side, is to install systems which we believe are going to keep those birds at optimum performance going forward. Now, that could be down to how we manage the heat, minimum ventilation, the cold weather, humidity, litter condition, all that, for example. But today, if we're talking about hot weather, are we going to keep them alive if we have a bird, for example, that can do the job in 28 days? And you know, in 28 days. So what we're trying to do is essentially ensure that today's houses are going to be as relevant for as long as possible. That's your investment, that's what money you're putting in. So it would seem sensible to me and to us as a company, to make sure that our ventilation systems right the way through, from summer through to winter, are, you know, is going to cope with these birds of the future. That's what we're trying to look at. And it seems odd to me that we're still putting specifications of houses, and this is what we find, that are pretty much the same as 2003, when we had that heat stress problem right back then. And the DEFRA welfare codes were written on the back of that. They need updating, of course, but that's what they were written on because of that event. Why are we still putting air change systems in which are equivalent to those days when we're 20 years down the line, and we've got to have birds which potentially we're putting an investment in which is going to be for 20 years in the future, you know, beyond that. So that's what we're trying to do, and that's what we're trying to talk about. So what I want to do now is go through the theoretical viewpoints of how we would specify a ventilation system. And we're going to just look at, first of all, about heat outputs and how birds appreciate, basically how they appreciate heat. Quickly, as it comes through, come on, there it goes. Right, what we have as, in terms of heat output from a bird is on the left-hand side here, we've got watts per kilogram of bird live weight. So a little chick is probably producing about 15 watts per kilo of, this is again for broilers, might be very, very similar for other classes of bird, but 15 watts per kilo for a broiler chick. But your big bird down on the bottom might be producing 6 to 7 watts per kilo of heat output. So that means that you get a big bird that is, they could be anywhere between 12 to 15 watts and possibly more of heat output. The little bird obviously hasn't got much heat output at all because he's only very small, but he is pro rata per kilo very, very much more metabolically active. So we have a situation where we're putting high energy food into this bird, and we're getting high metabolic rates, and we're having a high heat output. And that's what we have to try and manage. There's a note down there that says, yes, broilers consume approximately 7 times more energy per kilo of live weight than a human. There's a lot of obviously volumetric issues in there, but that we can deal with. But yeah, they're eating a lot of high density food, and they're putting out a lot. Can you just move it on a slide for me, please? Okay. This information comes from these people like there's Zinn et al. At the bottom, 2001. It shows total heat output in watts per kilo. We have to be a little bit careful sometimes. We have to, total heat output basically is both heat the bird can sense, what they call sensible heat output, and also their evaporative cooling, so latent heat. So you have to be a tiny bit careful about sometimes when you look at these heat production figures. But essentially, this is the sort of this diagram, this curve that we're seeing here, is a whole load of data that Zinn et al. Would have put into this model. Now that's back in 2001. We've just got to decide where on this line we take our graphs so that we can calculate the amount of heat that we're trying to get out of these birds. We have to manage them in much the same way as you'd manage a car engine. We have a huge amount of energy going in. So on the top slide on the left, they've got lots of that's your engine, that's all your heat source, and the birds are sitting together. I think you'll find there are actually turkeys actually in there, but this is one for Alan if you like the names. But we've got but we've got turkeys. They're turkeys. So you can see the thermal imaging bright spots, and down below, that's not a standard engine, that looks a little bit more F1 to me, down below there. But it's making a lot of heat, you know, and perhaps for the fuel you put in, it's making, birds might use 30% of it, and the car 25. But the bottom line is we've got to cool those birds down. We've got to radiate that heat away. We can do that with air inlets, you know, for the broilers, and we do that radiators for the cars, and we have to exhaust it. We have to also pull it away. So we have to have a system of pulling away. We've got an exhaust system on the Formula 1 car, and we've got fans for the birds. It's just a sort of a visual representation. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much because only mainly because of time. But we also remember, of course, that the heat that the bird has is not a problem to it when it sits in the middle in this thermo-neutral zone and the bird can manage it. What happens though is obviously as the temperature increases and it is relying on our ventilation system. Am I going too far? Sorry. Yeah. We're relying on our ventilation system. That bird slowly might start to move into what it calls the upper critical temperature, through its upper critical temperature, which basically means it's got to do something about losing heat actively. You know, we're giving it a certain amount of air going through it, it must try and do something itself. Now, if our air ventilation system is not sufficient, those birds move up on the red side, on the right side of the screen, they move up towards their maximum heat loss, and then they can't cope, they can't control their body temperature, and ultimately, well, certainly in a heat stress situation at the moment, they might die of that heat stress. So that's what we're trying to do. And if we look at these two pictures, essentially what we're saying here is that humans and broilers lose heat in different ways, and in a sense they do not feel heat. And I think that's a crucial part to take away from this, is that birds and humans, we don't feel heat in the same way. On the left-hand side, we see that the broilers, using the blue side, is far more evaporative cooling, is using the latent heat of evaporation, basically. Far more heat loss through evaporation, through lung evaporation. That's why they've got a vast network of air sacs and through the body. That's what they use to lose heat with. And what they call the sensible heat output, the actual air, the heat they lose through air temperature, what the thing you can measure with a temperature probe, that is quite small compared with the humans. So what we're saying with evaporation is humidity starts to become an essential part of the equation when we're looking at keeping these birds comfortable. Very quickly, because we haven't got time to move into relative humidity, I'm hoping a lot of you know, you might have heard me talking about it a lot on humidity, is that clearly the warmer, if you look at the red line, that's 100% relative humidity. You can see that as temperature increases along the bottom, we're getting a curvilinear sort of uplift in how much moisture the atmosphere holds. And if we get up to 30s and the 40s, what we can see is that it holds a huge amount of moisture, even at 50%. And your bird body temperature is around 40, even though it's panting out from its lungs, if we have high temperature and high humidity, that gradient between the moisture content of the lung and the atmosphere is very, very much reduced. And that's one reason why in our lovely temperate climate we get, whether we're getting it from tropical maritimes or whether we get a mixture with that and the continental, essentially that bird is in a hot, humid climate, and we have a problem with our humidity in this country. And that's really what we're just having a look at. I'm not going to get into relative humidities too much, but it's all about how much moisture that bird can move into air. Okay, that's what we're talking about. A few little charts now, which I'm going to run through, if you can sort of just bear with me. And what we're looking at, if I can't show, unless I don't know whether you can use it or your mouse on it, but I'm looking at is the idea of the 20 degrees and the 50% RH at bottom. You can see that 20 and 50% RH, and on the right hand side we have 25 degrees and 50 of it at the top as well, 50% RH. Now in print, what we've got is a bird that is losing watts of heat, essentially. A lot of this information has come from Mike Zarek over there at the University of, where is he? Virginia, is it? Yeah. Georgia, thank you, sorry. And what you can see is this total heat loss, let's say 20 watts. Now, you can see that the orange area, if you like, is that which it loses through conduction, convection, and radiation. That's its sensible heat loss. And in here it might be 8 watts, for example. And the blue section is what it's losing through respiration. So it's getting a reasonable percentage of 20 to 21 degrees, 50% RH. If you can imagine this is a fully stocked house of birds, what we're getting is a reasonable loss of heat through sensible heat, but majority is going through respiration, through latent heat of evaporation. Now, if we move across to the right-hand side, that temperature's gone up to 25 and 50. What you notice is because the air temperature's gone up, its sensible heat loss is going down. It's less able to lose heat through sensible heat loss because the air temperature is rising. The RH is the same, but because the RH is the same at a higher temperature, it can absorb more moisture, so that bird is able to cool a little bit more efficiently. So it might be, I'd say it's warm, but it can cope. So this is how our birds are working normally. As long as it has enough moisture, it's got enough water on board, it's not going to dehydrate, etc., etc. That bird can stay reasonably happy. I'm going to move on a slide if it will let me. Okay. Next slide is waiting, buffering. And I don't know what you guys can see at the moment. I've just got a black screen. Come on, there we go. Just taking a little while. Okay, and what we're looking at in this slide is again just the same situation, but I've got a constant humidity, 50%, 50%, 50%. But watch the air temperature increase, and what you'll notice again is the first two, the left and middle, are the same as last slide. Is that sensible heat loss is going down. The bird can cope to a certain extent in terms of its evaporative heat, cooling, but when you get to, let's say, 30 degrees and 50% RH, you have a deficit. Basically what it means is that the moisture in the air is now sufficiently high that bird is struggling to evaporatively cool, to breathe into that air. And so we're getting a deficit now. And that is when the birds start to become heat stressed. So we do talk about, we all know, we all go on about, oh, it's a humid environment. Yes, it is. It does have an impact, but it is that combination of temperature and humidity, i.e. how many grams of moisture is in the air and whether that bird can easily pant into it and cool itself down. So when it gets heat stress, this is where we start to get blood chemistry. Oh, is that Simon? Hello, yeah. Sorry, you're nearly unmuted, but not quite. Okay, I think you can go.
Sorry, there's you may get to it, but there's a figure that you get to that temperature plus humidity equals trouble. Is that?
Yeah, very much so, Simon. That is in the Fahrenheit days. And I'm afraid I was brought up on Fahrenheit, but I'm afraid I've lost my ability to speak that language now, I'm afraid. But in the Fahrenheit days, it was what they called the 160 rule. And so if you had a temperature combination in Fahrenheit plus humidity, equals 160, it was very probable that those birds were going to have difficulties. So that's where, and I think it's still a reasonable sort of rule of thumb. So if you had 90 Fahrenheit, which is, there's lots in there. You can see what I'm saying. That if it was 90 plus 70, you could be in trouble. It's a reasonable rule, but there's far more things obviously to go into that in terms of air speeds and air movements, etc. But no, that's a reasonable statement, yeah. So that was what they called the 160 rule. Oh, 32, there we go, 32 degrees 90. But that was how that rule would have worked. Yeah, so 160 is dangerous. We'll talk about a little bit later on about what they call the, not too great detail, but what they call the apparent equivalent temperatures, and that in a sense combines those things and how a bird senses wind chill. Okay, so moving on, and what we've done in this particular chart, again, where we haven't got heat balance really working very well for us, this time I've kept the temperature constant, so 25, 25, 25, but what we're getting is a dramatic increase in humidity. So, for example, this is that typical lovely time when we come across the evening, we all seen it, where those clouds roll in and, the thunder starts to build up and the air starts to crackle and sizzle. The RH has climbed, and that's when, don't we all say it's 4 o'clock, between 4 and 8 o'clock in the evening, if we're going to lose them, we're going to lose them. Down there. Now, my technical handler has just walked out the room, so if it all goes horribly wrong, it's his fault. So there we go. What we can see though is again that the sensible heat loss. I can't actually see it on, but the sensible heat loss here, in the orange, there is all the same, isn't it? Because the temperature's the same. So you get that. So it's losing heat through sensible heat loss to the same amount. But because the RH is increasing, the bird can cope in one scenario, but as the RH increases and it can't breathe, it can't pant into it properly, we start to get a deficit. And that's when, say, the bird's going to become increasingly heat stressed. So we can have a constant temperature, increasing RH, and we can lose them. And we can have a constant RH, but increasing temperature, and we can also have problems with heat stress. So these are things we're dealing with. This, and this is the principles, and that's what I'm trying to emphasise, the principles to which a bird is working in a broiler house. And the ultimate situation, for example, if we have an increase in temperature and RH, is that we could be in a position, I don't know, this is from a research station, a researcher, but we could be in a position on the right-hand side where if we're at 30 degrees centigrade and a very high humidity, that bird cannot actually pant into that atmosphere efficiently at all. So its core body temperature increases because it's just its lungs are going, its flanks are heaving, and it can't get rid of moisture. It's a dog in a car situation. There comes a point when it simply can't do anything more, and it becomes heat stressed and possibly might die. How do you get around that? That's the question. If you have got that, possibly we're in a bit of trouble. Now, all of these diagrams I saw you were actually taken, were basically sort of more laboratory locations in still air. So these are sort of examples of how a bird works. It's not really on farm, these things, but it gives you a good sense of what we're dealing with as a theoretical model. Now we can move it on. This is what we want. We want to move it on now. And even way back in 1981 with Simmons and Locke down there, what they were finding though is that if you increase the airspeed, they were finding that those birds were losing more and more heat with airspeed. That's that's logical. That's what we know, but it's proven fact. It does. They do. And so you can see that from the graph, as we move across the right, airspeed's increasing to 3 meters per second. I don't know about the 2.5. Okay, but don't worry about that. But that's increasing to 3 meters per second. And in principle, they're saying in this particular example that the birds were cooling themselves correctly at that high airspeed. That's the sort of thing you get in a tunnel. They also were showing that as the airspeed increases, what we were doing, we were actually increasing the orange, we were increasing the sensible heat loss as the airspeed are increasing. And if you're increasing their sensible heat loss, so through conduction, convection, etc., we're losing it that way, they were putting less stress on their ability or their need and the requirement to pant. So you can see the blue sections are coming down. Now, if you're up at 2 meters per second and 2.5, for example, you can see they've got good loss, heat loss going out through their through sensible heat loss, and that means they're not putting stress on their respiratory system to have to pant that away. And this is one of the crucial things again about running airspeed. It's not only does it obviously increase the cooling capacity, it does it as much as anything else by increasing the sensible heat loss, which means they're reducing their need to pant. And that's where airspeed becomes critical. And the next thing we're obviously going to be talking about in a minute is how you direct that airspeed to make sure that stays around their beats, because that's where the air comes out, isn't it? Essentially, all right, yes, they can lift feathers if they can and get air up through them. But basically, they're also still panting. And the better we can make them pant, but bearing in mind again that picture, they don't feel it the same way as we do. They get such a huge amount of cooling or feeling of cooling through through the evaporation side. We've got to keep that right. We've got to keep air moving over their heads. In terms of core body temperature, even way back in 1968, Drury and Siegel back down there in 68 had shown, and it doesn't change, is that if you increase the air speeds, their core body temperature of the bird drops. If you get it, so you're trading around 40 degrees centigrade on a broiler. If it gets up more than 44, you're in the realms of losing them. Also, the respiration rate, so as you can see on the note on the side, the respiration rate could be up 150 breaths per minute at sort of 0 to half a meter per second up on the left-hand side of this graph, and you can drop it right down to 20. Again, a huge amount of energy saving. Energy equals heat that you've got to get rid of, as well as sort of performance, but it equals heat you've got to get rid of. So we're trying to really get that respiration down, and that's again a benefit of getting some airspeed across these birds. You'll know what we'll talk about later, but we'll just see it here as well, is that 1 meter per second, that was a sort of minimum that DEFRA were talking about in 2003. And that's an absolute minimum airspeed. We would like to see it at 1.5 and more if we can get it practically, but that's what we're looking for. Okay. And very quickly, we have to obviously put this point, as Simon was making earlier, of wind chill and apparent equivalent temperature. We have an actual temperature. That's what the bird is going to be losing heat through, sensible heat loss. It's what the computer says. So the computer might sit there and say it's 27 outside. You think, yeah, okay, that's warm. But the apparent equivalent temperature is what the bird says it is. And that's obviously depends on its feathers, its health status, the humidity of the air, the whole raft of things are going to be going into that component. The picture actually on the side was an example which I had to deal with it back in the early 2000s, where it was it'd been like May. It was been hot, but not excessively hot all the way through. And these birds had actually got a case of clinical plantar necrosis, actually. It wasn't just pododermatitis, it had gone well beyond that. And the farm had hardly experienced under 13 degrees at night and sort of 25s, 26s all through the day. It was quite bizarre. So you think, well, how has that happened? And the answer is that actually you can see all the fan shafts open. The airspeed was too much for them. Those birds, as you can see from the way they were sitting, they didn't like it. It was hot outside. You thought those birds should be, set temperature 24 degrees. And it was maybe 26 in the house, but what they were telling you was they were frozen. They hated it. And they had so moved around and had been affected that they had actually got litter condition which had given them plantar necrosis. And it was very, very odd. First thing I did was let's switch 50% of the fans off. So I just manually switched 50% of the fans off. Let the temperature bob up to 27, 28 degrees. Slowed the airspeed down, and literally you can tell within 20 minutes the whole house was covered and birds were getting up and feeding and drinking even though they had bad feet, and off they went and did that. And that is an example of how the bird is telling you exactly what what the wind chill is. And with our birds nowadays, they're much more fickle than they used to be. You can have, 23, 24 degrees outside. You could be running all your ventilation, but you can have those birds hucking into the floor and not doing what they should be because they're too cold. But go 3 or 4 degrees warmer, if let's say you back off the temperature in that first situation and they all get up and spread and walk around, 2 or 3 degrees warmer outside, and they want everything you can give them. And we've just got to be a bit careful. That's how we've got to manage those birds and manage the wind chill and going over their backs. But anyway, that's just an example of what wind chill does. I'll add some pictures. These are some of the, down the right hand side, you can read for yourself some of the wind chill sort of things that we will vary how they feel. So yeah, ambient temperature, house temperature, ambient RH, feather status, feathering, health status, stocking rate, density, floor air speeds. All of those affect how the wind speed would work on them. And so just to summarize that bit before we kick off into the next thing, how are we doing? Probably terribly for time, but how are we going? So just to remind ourselves of that, I think we should be specifying, and we do, houses for the next 20 years, not keeping on where we used to be. We've got to remember that birds don't sense heat in the same way as we do. They rely on their lungs, they rely on that latent heat of evaporation in hot weather. Temperature and humidity are linked and have a huge impact. So airspeed, critical to core body temperature, and wind chill, how they perceive that wind chill is again crucial. You're all good there on that basis. We can only see some of you on the screen, so hopefully you're all happy. There's, yes, the ones we can see, there's some down the bottom screen, we don't know whether they're happy or not. Hopefully you all are happy, but we haven't got any way of really telling unless we unmute you all. Okay, now we're moving on into how actually then do we design the ventilation system to achieve all those things, which I hope you will admit is pretty conclusive that those birds need a lot of air going. They're going to need a lot of air going over because we've got challenging environment. In terms of the ventilation system, I'll always start with the air inlets first because that's what basically optimizes the distribution of that air over the bird. So we want to design. We are in a situation where we've got to deal with our normal weather and winter weather, and we're obviously trying to save a bit of money. That's what we're doing. Ultimately, we're trying to have ventilation systems that aren't excessively expensive. So we're trying to take air inlets that can do 2 jobs. In the good old days, as pictures, they used to have sometimes dedicated summer inlets, and they were fantastic. Nowadays, we're trying to do, there's that picture on the right. What we're trying to do is get air onto the floor using deflectors, but also that same system to work the winter. So we want a good coverage over the floor as well. They have to be specified for a fast enough air inlet speed so that we can get air right across that floor, and it's got to tackle the feather stall that you're going to get by moving that air over them, the turbulence from that air moving over the birds and over feeders, for example. It's got to stay fast enough and not stall enough so that natural buoyancy. Bear in mind, these birds, if they've got 15 watts of heat, we'll get 50,000 birds, that's making 750 kilowatts of heat uplift. There's a lot of heat that wants to move off that floor. If you get air speeds going much below 0.5 meters per second, you'll find that natural buoyancy starts to take over again, and the air will want to move away from the birds, and will start to destroy the natural circulation that we want in the house. So that comes in. Air inlets are very, very important. And then to make those air inlets work, we need sufficient fans to do the job. So what we're looking at is how are we going to keep that house as close as we can to the ambient temperature. There's nothing much we can do if it's 30 outside. You can't have it less than 30 inside unless you've got an air conditioning system, but you can keep it as close as possible to the ambient temperature. We then need to know what airspeed we want to bring that air through. So we want enough air change to keep the ambient right. We've got to bring that airspeed in through that inlet fast enough to direct it over the floor that we get the airspeeds that we want. As a sort of a visual way of looking at it, you might have to use the mouse perhaps. What we've got is the bird out there actually kicking out 15 watts of heat. We've got a little bit coming off the litter. We've got a big sun out there producing lots of heat over the surface area of the house. That's the A part of it. We've also got that solar radiation penetrating through the structure of the house, which is why insulation is really important. That's the QH going through there. So we've got heat being transmitted through the roof and through the ceiling, for example, through the roof and through the walls and through blockwork, etc. So what we're trying to do is, if we're bringing air in at 30 through the house, we have what they call in the middle this delta T, which is just the difference between outside temperature and inside temperature, and we require fans to obviously exhaust that air sufficiently so that we can keep a theoretical inside temperature within 3 degrees of outside. And I'm stating it's a theoretical one because it's to do with the amount of heat that bird puts in relative to the specific heat capacity of air coming in and how much of that air we've got to bring in to keep those birds within 3 degrees. And this is why I say down the bottom in the green, we have maximum ventilate is balanced to +3. That's what we're trying to achieve. You don't have to worry about all these formula, but basically what we're looking at is on the delta T, we've got 3 degrees in here. We've got QS, which is the heat input from the birds. We've got QH, which is all the rest of it in terms of various bits of solar penetration and other heat sources. When you work that together and put QS in there at a high enough figure, which is what we should be doing down there, you'll get a ventilation rate. And that is factoring all of those things we're just looking at on that previous graph. It was developed by, Saville Clark down in 78, Dr. Charles down in 81, down the bottom here. And it's basically, it's true then, it's true today. We just got bigger, fatter birds which produce more heat. So that's where the QS part has to change a little bit. Now, why do we say that? Why have we chosen +3? Why is it not different? Well, the reason that we've always done +3, and Silso, I think, came up and say, Dr. Charles came up with these figures of a temperature lift of +3, is that when you actually plot how the delta T against how much air you need to change, you will find that 3 degrees is sort of, can you mouse that? The 3 degrees on the black line is sort of closer to the 0 point on the graph, if you see what I mean. If you go up, if you try and ventilate to +1, you can see that massive amount of air change. You need 35,000 cubic meters of air per 1,000 birds to get a delta T of 1. And you can pay, we'll sell it to you if you want, we're more than happy. And we'll go on holidays to the Bahamas and all that, but it's not realistic, is it? On the other hand, you will see that if we go to +5, and this is where we have problems where people specify at +5 because we think we're climate zone 1, then you actually start to underventilate. And that has knock-on effects to how many air inlets you're going to place, what velocities you can achieve across the floor. The +3 was because that was the optimum point on that curve between stupidly large amounts of air change and not enough, and being a little bit too cheap, to put it finely. And it's always been 3 degrees in the UK, okay? And that's what we've always kept to within Draper. It will, and the graph is going to change a little bit as the metabolic outputs of these birds increase. So that's what we're looking at, and that's why we have this 3 degree ventilation rate. So it is based on a real thing. It's not just us saying we want to sell you more fans. It really is based on something. That then translated into the ADAS equivalent ventilation rate. So you have all these things, and then we can come into how do we actually sort of calculate it, and we can pretty much put these numbers into this formula where we have 1.85 times basic 10 minus 3. This first bit is essentially a sort of a fiddle factor, if you like. It's a constant. Then we've got the live weight. The 0.75 is because we're looking at the metabolic output. Now that graph has somehow gone back. It's amazing, isn't it, how it's gone inverted and backwards. Now I don't know how that's happened, but there it is. But that graph on the side essentially shows you this curvilinear metabolic output. Times the bird numbers, times 3,000, and we get a ventilation rate. And that ventilation rate is designed to give you this +3, essentially. So they've taken all the sort of the back maths and they put it into this formula. And that's where we get our maximum ventilation rates from. Now, we've seen this graph, haven't we, just a bit earlier, we're also trying to aim for ventilation, for air speeds across the floor. Now, DEFRA were basically saying whenever the air change capacity, whatever the air change capacity variable is critical to distribute the air uniformly, high speed, to all the birds in hot weather. It wasn't actually telling you what the air change should be. DEFRA are far too coy about doing things like that because it might upset people. But they're basically saying whatever you do, it's got to be as high air speed over the floor as possible. They did specify a minimum of 1 meter per second back in 2003. But as I say, we're trying to aim for more than that nowadays. So how do we get that across the floor? Now, if we look at a sidewall air inlet system, and down the side, on the left-hand side, we've got air velocity. And also you can say that's the wall. That's where the air's coming in on the side. And going across the bottom, that's meters away from that sidewall towards the middle of a sort of a standard house, if you see what I mean. And a 60-foot house is what, 18.3, isn't it? So 9 meters would be sort of where you are on a 60-foot house, for example. Now, if we go back far enough and look at the 9 meters and the amber line, which is at the bottom, you can see it's at 30 pascals. So yeah, here's a hat farm running 30 pascals pressure. It comes in relatively quickly, and you can see as it comes in, it drops off its velocity really quickly as we come in from meters from the wall. Sorry, I'm walking out the screen again. As it comes out from meters from the wall, you can see it dropping its velocity. And I put a line roughly, when we have, this is with our deflectors, when we're recording something like this, we'll see the air hitting the floor around this level, between these two lines. And then it slows down and plateaus as it goes along. But on the 30-meter line, you'll see that it plateaus, starts to get down to 1 meter per second, hold it around 1 meter per second around the sort of the center of a 60-footer. But if you go wider, if you've got an 80-footer, you're losing it. You're starting to lose energy. Basically, that airspeed has lost energy into the birds, into the litter, into all the structure around it. And it's slowing. Well, you can see for yourself. If we want at least 1 meter per second, preferably 1.5, you ain't getting it with 30 pascals. If you go to 40 pascals, which is anywhere around the 6 to sort of 7 meters per second, we tend to put 7 in nowadays. So that little graph will be up probably very slightly, because that was a starting inlet one of about 6.6 there. What is happening is it is on a 60-footer, it's nailing it, isn't it? But you see that flat line stays high all the way along. It's not just joining the 30 pascal line. It's staying actually above that line right the way through to the center of an 80-foot house, and it's giving us good airspeeds. And this is pretty repeatable. But as I say, it's doing it with 40 pascals, so a fast inlet airspeed, but that air is deflected onto the floor. It's got to have that deflection on it. However we do it, whether it's summer inlet, whether you put a deflector on it, however it does it, that's how you get it. And so the bottom line, it's all right. It's getting a bit sketchy on a wide house, basically. Okay, if it's at 30 pascals. Now, sometimes you get ratings where people say it's 30 pascals, but that's because it's the nominal pressure of the house, and that's what they run it all summer and winter. Yeah, well, we run our houses sort of nominally quite often, at lower pressures, but it's the summer, it's the hot weather specification that has to be high. So yeah, nominal 30. What's your hot weather spec? So that's really critical. So when you're taking a house and looking at the specification from it, you've got to get that, to my mind, 40 pascals. And to be honest, why not have 40 pascals, whether it's a narrow house or a wide house? Have it. If you can, just build it, design it that way. And then if you've got a narrow house, you just got plenty of air over their backs. There's no point in designing it for less. So there we go. So you can all see how that works. And again, if you get out there and did your own smoke tests and airspeed meters, you would start to find that sort of graph emerging.
Mike's got a question.
Oh, Mike, sorry, I've gone. Oh, Mike.
Mike, can you unmute yourself?
Mike,
if you've got a question, Mike, can you unmute yourself?
What can we? I
can't unmute you, Mike. You need to unmute yourself.
He's gone very still. It looks like he's got. Oh yeah. All right. Oh no, he is. Yeah. There might be. There should be a button there somewhere for you.
Hello.
Hello, yeah, we got you.
We can hear you, Mike.
Hi, morning all. Just how high do you reckon we can push this pressure up to, Justin?
It does depend. Again, it's down to fan laws. Yeah, it's down to fan laws basically, but most of the fans you'll find fitted in any house today will probably be okay up to 45 pascals. So you're looking 7 meters, and perhaps an that's over, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because after that, what happens is you are, depending on the fan you've got, you're starting to cause that fan to use a lot more electricity and get a little bit warm. But B, you start coming up to its stall point. It is possible, and we've seen this, where gables have been fitted to fans which are already up near the stall point and actually stall the roof fans. And that's with gable fans. So you have to be a bit careful, but I would say 45 with a good fan, a good high pressure fan. You should be all right. And I know your particular farm possibly has those fitted, so you probably could get up there with those ones.
Yeah, we tend to run generally at about 45. That's why I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, that's fine. You'll have another thing which I will come on to in a minute, which may or may not be happening on your farm, but it does worry the what's it out of me, and that's the whole area of distribution and how we actually place the air over the floor. So it's good that you've got, I know you've got fans that can probably do that. Not all fans can. If you've got single phase fans out there, you're going to struggle a lot more with this, I'm afraid. Then again, there are some old ones, that you get some people have got 40-year-old woods that will, put a tractor along. It's just, that just keep on grinding away and keep on going against quite high pressures. We are in the age of electrical efficiency, aren't we? And saving the planet through that way. And so a lot of the fans are not necessarily designed to pull much more than skins off rice puddings. And it's, that, so you'll find that if you go over 40 pascals, some of them can suffer. It's an area which doesn't get talked about a huge amount when people are speccing out their farms, but the ability for that thing to have, it's like torque backup. That's what diesel engines have, isn't it? They can keep on just grunting away because they're on detonation engine, you get torque backup. But a lot of fans we get are a little bit like petrol engines where, they go on, they scream away and they're very good when they're going, but if you start pulling them off the rev range, they have no torque. And this is where you have this slide now, which essentially says, that you have to make sure you have a fan specified appropriately. So the fan performance does decrease with increasing pressure. And the important thing is that when you have when you're quoting your houses, let's say you have 20 fans. If you quote a house of 20 fans at 0 pascals, that might be fine. The numbers might work, but actually your house is working at 40 pascals. So that might mean you actually need 23 fans or something like that to do the same job. Now, it might look good again in the brochure. If you have 20 fans, it says it can do what it does, but it does depend on that pressure. If at 40 pascal that performance is way down, you can see the sort of the curve off on the graph, and it's how much that graph curves down over pressure. You have to specify the sheds for operating at that 40 pascals, so we can get our maximum air change that we want at 40 pascals, so we get the airspeed we want. And across all those birds. So again, that's the danger of not including the correct pressures into these systems. Different fans do different jobs. What we've got here, if Paul comes back in a minute, because we get is a typical sort of air pattern if you do have deflection. What we're looking for, and we'll show you videos of these in a minute, and I'm just going to wait for Paul to come back, and it'll it's where pictures are more than 1,000 of me speaking. But what we've got is airflows. We all know in a standard house, don't we? The air goes up the ceiling, doesn't it, towards that chimney, comes down in the middle and wanders back towards the floor. Now that's the air pattern we're all trying to achieve, isn't it? That nice rotating, counter-rotating circular air pattern. In hot weather, what we want to do is reverse it and reverse it properly so that air actually comes down the ceiling and the main part of the air goes along the floor to the middle and then up. So you get a rotating current of air, because air likes to go in circles, but it does it in exactly the opposite way of what you do in in the winter. What you can't be doing is having it doing partly. It's a bit like saying, oh, I'll just open my inlets halfway open and all the air fall on the floor. We know we don't want that. You get problems and air doesn't go in the right places. You don't want it in your normal ventilation. You certainly don't want it in your summer ventilation on a sidewall inlet. I don't know whether the next slide is actually a video or is it? Oh yeah. So we were looking at just something a sort of an idea of it, of how the air comes across. We've got some better videos sometimes. Oh, hello. I can see Mike directly.
You're up there.
Oh, I'm up there. I'm still up there. So we're just waiting for a bit of a video, perhaps to come up. It's only a small one. Some of you might have seen it. What?
Stand to the side of it.
Oh,
it's up there.
Oh, sorry. Get out of the way. So is that right? Yeah. So you can sort of get the idea that the air essentially, I don't know where you saw it from. Did you get it from the beginning or not? Essentially, the air goes across the floor. You have another one to show. Does it show it coming down the roof? Yeah. Okay. You see, there you go. Air coming down the roof, into the air inlet system, and basically that smooth airstream down the roof is showing that you're going to get a nice smooth counter-rotating current across the floor as well. It doesn't have to be, absolute. And there's a sort of, I think, so what's that say, 7 meters per second?
Yeah. Yeah,
so we sort of 7 meters per second, and I don't know whether you can see those, they're sort of possibly 2 meters or something going across the floor. So that's what it's doing. Air goes down the ceiling, and this is just other videos of just standard smoke pattern going up the ceiling. So that smoke pattern, you're just reversing it, but at much faster air speeds, essentially, or similar air speeds, just reversing it and putting volume right through it. Okay. So that's the general principle of air down the ceiling, into the floor, along the floor, and then up. It should go right to the middle of it, and then up into the fans. Yeah.
Back to the presentation.
Oh, back to the presentation. Although it's just the next one, just be a similar sort of. We can go on to another one. Oh, is that one off? What we find and have. Oh, yeah. I can come back in a minute. So we just sort of, you have to go back again in the middle. What we're finding, though, what we find with smoke patterns, and again, Paul will show a video in just a second, is that where we have inlets without deflection, right? This is slightly exaggerated, but you can judge this for yourself from the video. But what happens is we get some movement on the floor, but a lot of the air is expected to go up or into the middle of the body of the house. Now, what that tends to do is disrupt the counterflow pattern. So you'll get some air movement on the floor. It might go to halfway across the floor, and then you tend to get the air lifting up and going turbulent, and you tend not to get air movement in the middle of the house. Now, this Paul has got. Is this the one? Actually, it's not.
Everybody see that?
Oh, is this one's also this is down to the different design. Is that the one I was going to? I want the crofty. Sorry, your old ones, really.
Oh, right.
Can we have the old ones? We'll see. Yeah, just the old ones first. You might. So so this is what can happen with non-deflected inlets. Whatever type you've got, if you don't put that deflection on it, it tends to do that.
So this is a 90-foot wide shed here. Back in 2000. This is just post 2003 disasters.
You can all see the video, can you? Okay.
So this was rear down inlets. This is the system running flat out.
Okay. This is Paul's video, so Paul can talk.
Yes, sorry about the quality of the video. It's a bit grainy.
It's old.
Yeah.
Cameras those days.
It was a good camera at the time. But, so you can see that the air there is penetrating a certain. This is the real indicator. So this is 2 smoke machines, one either side on the oversails, under the oversails, and synchronized pressing the buttons basically. But that's showing you the amount of penetration that the airspeed is making into the shed basically. So you can see it just, the whole center area of the shed, and that was where the mortality was in that shed, was down the center of that shed. if you look at the sort of the next stage of the video, this is showing the smoke coming across where you think, yeah, so I'm stood in the center of the shed there, expecting that smoke to make it right the way across to the center of the shed, but it's coming in, and it's kind of like lifting up straight away. You know, in that shed, you just make the presumption, you know, I mean, the inlets are more or less butted up against each other. You think you've got plenty of inlets. You know, there was stacks of fans in there, you know, for the size of the shed. And so this was the smoke test that I kind of really illustrated as I walked across the shed, just to see where the airspeed was losing it. You know, I've still got airspeed there, but you can see it's just going up like a curtain as soon as I get, and this is probably 10 or 15 foot in from the sidewall. At this point there, it's lifting. So the air is actually doing like this figure of 8. It's going back down the ceiling there, but it's just getting no penetration across the floor. And you can start to see there, it's actually going backwards. And then again, as I come across, it's getting worse and worse essentially. So, and you can see the sort of the last shot in the center of the shed there. My smoke machine's creating the draft there. Yeah, when you press the button on the smoke machine, it blows a load of it creates some air distribution itself, and it's the only draft there is actually the draft from the smoke machine. So I'd say that was a big eye opener. I never used that type of inlet.
But you got the next one
ever again. Yeah, which one would you like?
Just do your second, your
right. So this video is a shed that I actually ventilated a long time ago down in Devon for a guy. So similar sort of width, 80 foot, not 90 foot. I created in the shed the high pressure still, the 40 pascals. Bear in mind that last one was at 40 pascals as well. But this had a different design of inlet. So it had let's say the fans are identical virtually. The fan power was identical. But you can see on the smoke test, the air straight away you can see is penetrating right the way across the floor. Obviously, this is an empty shed, and there's no birds in the shed. But the same video again with the synchronized 2 smoke machines are seeing how the air comes in and hits in the middle. And when you actually look at that on the video, you can track the speed of that as well, because you can just see that you can mark a piece of smoke and measure how long it takes to get the 12 meters across, so you can work out the average meters a second, and it's easily achieving the 2 meters a second. So this is the smoke coming towards you again, and you can see I'm just stepped back slightly from the center there, but it's penetrating right the way across, and it's lifting up. And I understood the normal dynamics of a poultry shed, if you like, then, that we were trying to jet air up the ceiling and then back across the floor in normal conditions. That's what it was all about, if you like, for your conventional ventilation. But this was the real eye-opener of compared to that previous video that we saw, that I've got this smoke. And you look at the angle of that smoke and the distribution, the speed on that smoke, and this is right the way across to the center of the shed there. And you can see it lifting in the middle of the shed. So that was a thing that taught me, obviously, that air always has to work in circles, and this reversing of the air. So this is a smoke machine right in the center of the shed there. Look, so putting a load of smoke, you can see the amount of lift that you're getting on that. Whereas that previous, video was just sat there. I think in a little while, the one that really brought it home to me and I didn't really fully understand it, if you like, until I went and edited the videos and analysed all the videos that I'd taken at the time. The one that is is this one, because look at that speed of the smoke coming back down the ceiling there, and that's when I saw that, the penny completely dropped then. That it's not just about getting air into the shed, it's actually about getting air across the floor of that shed, but then also making that air have enough space to come back down the ceiling on itself. It's like, you're stirring the air inside the shed, and if you can't let the air get back on itself, then it can't get the penetration across.
So again, that that was one of the points of what we've all been trying to do with deflected sort of inlets, was precisely because of this. Is you can have as much air change as you like, but if you don't put it in the house correctly, you'll get turbulence, you'll get all sorts of issues going on, and you'll get stall.
So I mean that was videos from back in 2003. Do you want to show the other one now?
Yeah, there was one. Yeah, essentially though, the other one is a test, you know, something, smoke test that's been done, and this is with to a certain extent with blade design. So this is a bottom hinged blade. Again, it's not no deflectors, but it's got a bottom hinged blade, and at the, you know, at reasonable velocities, it was sort of like 35 Pascal, this thing. At 35 Pascal, this is what this particular inlet was doing.
But what you can see is there's air going down, but there's also air's still allowed to travel upwards as well. And this is the real failing of inlet design, really. You know, they're designed great for winter ventilation, but they don't have a great thought about what they're trying to achieve with certainly like the design of a UK house, where they're generally quite low sidewalls, you know, and reasonably low pitch as well. You know, they're not 3 meters or 4 meter sidewalls and 18-degree pitch. They tend to all be, you know, 2 meters tops at the sides and 10 to 15 degrees. But as Justin's going across there, again, you can see there, that's the same air pattern in the center of that shed there, as in not a lot, or next to nothing, as we saw back in 2003. Simon, sorry, one sec, let me just unmute you a sec.
I'm sorry if anyone else had questions. You'll have to unmute yourself and yell otherwise. But
Go for it.
Can I also see that you're also running some? You've got the ridge fans, but you're also running the end fans as well in that video. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, if you like, where the fans are, you know, they tend to be. We tend to suggest at least 50%, 60% if you can get are in the roof, and the other 40% in the end as classed as a sort of hot weather ventilation fans. You know, it's, if you're running decent high pressures in a shed, then the air coming in at the furthest point away from the gable fans is the same as the air coming in at closer to the gable fans. It's the same speed. You know, if it's the same size inlet opening, which it is because the inlets are even all the way down the shed, then it's the same airspeed coming in there, it's the same volume, it's going to achieve the same things. There is a gradual draw, if you like, down to the end of the shed, because there's a fair percentage of your fan capacity is in the gable end, but I think it's important to have a fair amount, you know, a decent amount in the roof as well. Yeah.
So that was unaffected actually by the gables being on. It was exactly the same air pattern, whatever you did with it. So that just showed that was more. It was a bottom deflected inlet, but again, bottom flap inlet. But the way that the flap was sort of, if I go one forward, was pointing, because I just had I think that was that one. That was this sort of the design here. If you can put that on the flap, see basically the flap on the inlet being bottom deflected. The only way that the air would fall to the floor was if it was at very low velocities. Now, again, I sometimes perhaps rudely say a lot of inlets were designed originally for pigs, and if you have 15 pascals, which is what a pig likes, that air would have just dropped to the floor and ambled along the floor to the middle of the house, but it wouldn't have done it with any velocity. Now, pigs don't like velocity, but broilers do. So it's a case of, you know, in a sense, that inlet design for hot weather is never going to work on the inside of this house, because if you want high velocity, it's just the actual blade of that inlet is just firing the air. Well, you saw what it did. You know, we don't need to tell you. And so it was actually, when as soon as I saw it, again, fantastic for all other times of year except hot weather, basically. And it was fairly obvious to see in this particular situation where we were asked to look at this, that's what it did. Okay, so you can see essentially why, all I'm saying is why we would specify and why we would caution anyone, you know, to have a look to get their hot air system smoked. Or if you're going forward, if you're putting new system, you've got to have, in my mind, you just have to have deflectors in the house. Yeah, I've got to finish. We're through pretty much. Oh, I can't make it move. But I am nearly over now, guys, and so you'll be sort of question time in a minute. We're not doing that one, we've done that. This, for example, good old-fashioned house, isn't it? 8-foot bay, made out of a piece of, 8-foot timber. And you can see in the middle, there is actually just where the chain hangs down the middle, that is a bottom opening deflector, inlet.
We found back in 2003 when we had the disastrous, disastrous Saturday that we had in 2003. These old sheds with this top and bottom inlet kept more birds alive. They had less mortality issues with big birds in these sheds than brand new sheds with what we thought were the best inlets in the market, that probably had effectively double the amount of fan capacity in these sheds as well. So in these new sheds compared to the old sheds, the old sheds had the old traditional wooden fan chimney with an old woods fan in it, with a lid on the top and a lid underneath. But this inlet just created this way that you could shut the top inlet and open the bottom inlet and just create this draft directly over the birds. And I'd say we saw much lower losses in these sheds, which was obviously quite an embarrassment and quite a shock as well. So
so those are the sort of things which are excellent, and it just, if anything, it just goes to prove the point. If you, again, all that air would have been directed to the floor, and if you had smoke tested, you would have got a counter-rotating airstream through it. The other little areas you can have things is these oversails. You just got to make sure, if you've got an old house, that these are dimensioned correctly to let enough air through and are not compromising the performance of the house. You will get restrictions. I just thought I'd put a lot of the restrictions due to construction constrictions. But basically, that distance of the oversail from the ground, it's got to be able to, the lower the airspeed going through any obstruction or constriction, the lower the airspeed, the less pressure it places on the whole system. So if you have tight constrictions, it can actually cause quite a loss of fan performance. And these are sort of the typical areas that you have to look at. It's making sure that the oversail, that distance to the ground, that oversail there, any lumps of wood in the way, does not cause a problem to your operation. And the other one that is can be a real one, I've seen it, you've got to be so careful, is windows opening. And you've got nice window opening in hot weather, and then actually it's up against an oversail, and you just got you wonder why it's all going horribly wrong, and that can be why. So just remember that one is quite an important one. Okay, so if just a summary, with maximum ventilation rates, we've always specified at a delta T this temperature lift of 3 degrees for very good reasons to do with the optimum sort of capacity, fan capacity versus cost, if you see what I mean. And it gives us good fast air speeds and good coverage. And that's what I mean by the good fast. So inlets at 6 to 7 meters per second. So you're around 40 pascals. You can get air speeds of 1.5 meters per second over the floor if you fit hot weather deflectors properly. Why don't we use tunnels so much? There are many tunnels. Many tunnels were fitted after 2003. They're always, people, unfortunately, if you do a tunnel right, but you also then want to build it correctly for the rest of the year, you end up putting a lot of inlets in, and that costs money. A lot of roof fans in, that costs money, as well as the tunnel system. If you try and compromise in the UK, by saying, right, here's my tunnel system, here's my tunnel inlets, and only putting a couple of inlets in, you will always end up maxing out the sidewall inlets and going into tunnel, and birds today don't like it. They don't like tunnel ventilation unless it's really nice and warm outside. You have a lot of issues with birds settling down on the floor, and you end up with people putting the inlets back in. So great, I don't mind it. We're not going to get into misting systems today unless you want to talk about it later, but I don't, it's one of those things. Great if you can afford it, but you mustn't compromise on the ventilation for the rest of the year. I think that's pretty much leaving it where it is now, and I don't know how we're going to open it up unless you all unmute your microphones. I mean, if you want to, you can always disappear. No one will take offence if you sort of decide you want to wander off. then shut down. But
yeah, so yeah, hopefully we'll find a way. I think we're quite adaptable like that. We don't, what we don't want to do is compromise on the technical.
Hello, Graham.
But we are quite accommodating in saying, okay, well, let's find a way, make this work for you and your landlord.
That's very interesting sort of insight into Graham Frankfurt's sales technique there for the world in general to go at. He's probably on the phone to someone else. That's a bit cruel, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, from you unmuted.
We can unmute anybody who's got questions, basically. But yeah. Or unmute yourself if you've got any questions. Just hit your unmute button.
I'm sorry, you know, with the limitations of the screen is that we can only have about 4 or 5 faces on the screen, so there might be a lot of people. We've got everyone, have we? That may or may not be on there. Some are not on video, so I can't see you. Just might be on just. Anyone, you know, Matt. Hopefully, I don't know whether you've got any questions, and Adrian, and you're all good. Because I suppose, I mean, you can adapt this across into, let's say, rearing houses. The principles are the same. So if you take a layer rearing house, a breeder rearing house, broiler breeder house, the principles are very broadly similar. And turkeys, of course. I know turkeys don't like quite, you know, they tend not to like the air movement quite as vigorously, do they? And you might like to tell us what they, you know, what they think of it. But you know, they don't need necessarily the pressure. They prefer to have the volume of air, but not quite the fast air movement.
Yeah, turkeys can be quite different because they actually. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go on,
Alan.
Yeah, do you want to
unmute you? One sec. There you go.
Well, I mean, the discussion and what you told us, I found very interesting. But we've got naturally ventilated houses with winchable screen sides. So we haven't got the fans, we haven't got the fancy inlets, and I'd be curious to hear about misting systems and
is this
how
with turkeys, Alan?
Yeah.
This is for turkeys, for big stags, from going up to 18, 20 kilos.
Yeah, which we've done a few again with, you know, powered houses. I think with the natural ventilation, if I don't think, for example, some of the best results I've seen with hot weather misting, hot weather ventilation in naturally ventilated houses have been sometimes when they've been a dual system or where they've been top hinged, so that the air actually is forced to the middle of the house. So whilst you have cracks and the air comes in and might wander up the ceiling or do whatever it does normally. If you have top hinged inlets, that air will still, just due to the stack effect, will come further into the centre of the house and provide quite a decent bit, depending on how your system's working, can provide some air movement into the middle of them. We've certainly done that. We've certainly done it with broilers where we've had bottom hinged systems, and in fact, some of them we've had 2 double systems, if you like one, a row of inlets at the eaves, much fewer inlets up at the eaves, and then we've had summer inlets at the bottom, because if the inlets are at the bottom, just above, let's say, the dwarf wall, you then actually get a higher stack effect, because it's all to do with the difference between inlet and outlet, obviously the height difference. So if you're taking air in at the eaves, and that could be a couple of meters higher than let's say the dwarf wall, the block wall down there, that can reduce
I'd say the lacking, the difficulties that come with naturally ventilated systems is obviously, you know, well, it's the word natural, isn't it? Sounds good at the time, but obviously the natural thing that can happen is that you can have a day that's hot and humid with 0 wind. You know, and so your wind in a natural ventilation shed is ultimately your fan power, isn't it? Is dictated by the amount of wind that you get blowing over the top of the shed or into the sides of the shed.
If it's designed correctly, you should be able, that thermal uplift.
You should get
because of the thermal uplift from the birds. If you get a big enough exhaust, and often the limitation is on the exhaust side. If you've got a limitation on your exhaust, it limits your inlets, and you're stuck on pole barn sort of air going in. I don't know whether Simon's trying to get in as well on this one. But if you get a really good exhaust, you can then that becomes your limit, you know, and unlimit that. Then you should be able to get good air movement from the sides.
You know very well we had a horrible naturally ventilated shed that was badly designed from the start, and we've dealt with that now. But we found misting needs airspeed, doesn't it, to work? And what we did was put oscillators on the roof to cool the roof down, rather than mist, because we didn't. I don't think we had the airspeed for misting to work in a naturally ventilated shed.
Yeah, I think if you want to make a naturally ventilated shed work, you've got to put some mechanical assistance to this, to the end. You can get your air change okay if you like, because the system will lift the air out of the shed and bring air in through the sides. That kind of works, but it's actually creating that airspeed. You need potentially some internal circulation to assist that. He's just drawing on the screen at the moment. One sec. He has got a whiteboard behind him there, if you can see it.
We had sort of systems like this. Well, what we did was, I don't know whether you can see that. Can you see the whiteboard at the back? Where we did put in some fans. So we had a fan that would sort of do this. So this was just a freestanding fan under the air inlet, and he would blow in like that, and then this chap would blow in across like this, if you see what I mean. And this one would do that. And so you didn't have to have them in every. So we sort of had one wall, miss a bay, opposite wall, miss a bay, back to the first wall, if you see what I mean. And you could just use single phase fans blowing across, and that would cover us. But it would do 50, 60, easy 60-foot houses very nicely. And you've got that counter-rotating sort of movement here, and a little bit of turbulence in the middle, which the birds don't mind because it just mixes it all up. And that pushes it in, and you can even cloak to a certain extent. You don't want it too much, but you can even back off your eave inlets a little bit, just to make sure that air was forced up, and took heat up north and out, so it kept the heat out. But that system we used that on some broiler farms which were struggling over in Norfolk, actually for Banham a while ago, and that did work. But of course, it depends on your power. But sometimes if that or losing your birds, there's always an idea where you can hook a generator up just to run that particular system. So put a tractor on a PTO, just crank it up, start it up, and then you can have some single phase fans, because all they're doing, they're not working under pressure, they're just working at flat chat, 0 pascals, blowing air across. That has done well. We've also used that on a farm down at down Denway, haven't we? Yeah, on some free range ones. And that has just got you out of a spot where there were some designs that weren't fantastic. You can see, you can sort of see.
I mean, ultimately, turkeys are different to broilers. Broilers want to all sit down, whereas turkeys tend to stand up. A lot of the issue with broilers and why you're not just trying to remove the heat from the birds and remove the humidity from the birds with this speed across them, but they do want to tend to sit down as well. So which traps a lot of heat in underneath them, whereas turkeys do. Ultimately, if you put too much airspeed over a turkey, it sits down, and then that's not what you want it to do. They generally like to stand up, don't they, and stay stood up. And then the heat, you don't get that great big build up of heat underneath them.
They're just massive beach balls, aren't they, on legs really? And I mean, and they're like 50 odd kilos per square meter, aren't they? At the end of the day, when you've got sort of, well, per square meter, isn't it? Is it?
Okay.
What's that sort of body weight? Like 1 or 2 birds equivalent. Yeah.
That's the theory. Can I ask in the design with the small fans pointing across the shed? I mean, did you use misting or fogging as well, or was it just?
Yeah, the misting thing really, Alan, goes back to the beginning of Justin's talk, where we were talking about like the capacity that's left in the air. Misting is great when you've got your higher temperatures and low humidities, because you've got some capacity. I mean, the facts are there. Every 1 degree that you drop temperature by using a misting system, or every time you drop a degree, your RH is going to increase by 4.5 points, so 4.5%. So you can see that if you knock 5 degrees off your set temperature, you can be increasing 20% on the RH. So if you're already at 50 or 60% RH, and 30 degrees, and you think, great, I'll drop my temperature to 25. You could be up at 70, 80% RH by doing that. 70, 80% RH and 25 is a danger zone for the birds again. So I'd say the misting systems are great for when you're in the 20s in this country, you know, as an ambience outside in the 20s, because you can apply them to knock a few degrees off the shed and keep the birds performing where they should be. But it's not an answer for a 30 to 35 degree temperature when we have the humidities that we do in this country, because you're basically creating a colder temperature, but you're creating an environment where those birds still need to be able to cool themselves with their evaporative cooling system inside their bodies, and they can't anymore because there's no capacity left in the air. When you think about you know, mortality issues, whenever you see them, are always at tea time. You know, you might get a few during the day, but generally they all happen as soon as the temperature drops outside. You know, and you think, well, why is that? Is that because the birds have been going all day and they just suddenly decided they've had enough when the sun drops? It's not. It's because when the temperature drops outside, when the sun goes down, everybody thinks, great, there's 10 degrees cooler outside now. The air inside the shed will maybe have only dropped half a degree by that point. You know, to drop it down, it might take all night for the temperature in the shed to drop down. But meantime, when the temperature drops outside, the RH goes up, and the capacity within that air to absorb moisture is dramatically reduced. You've suddenly really changed the environment inside those sheds. So running misting systems can work at the right time during the day potentially, but then you have to be very, very careful with them when the temperature starts to drop outside, because suddenly you're adding moisture into air that the birds need to add moisture into, and you're taking that bit of capacity away from them basically, and that's when those birds, you know, can't cope. So
if Alan, if you did do something like this and you put misting on, again, I think you will find as long as we're not getting stupid high temperatures, and this is the thing we're talking about, is that misting systems, I think within our climate are not the be all and end all, I'm afraid, for very hot weather. We have to do it with air, it's my opinion. But having a misting system for many, many other conditions where it is warm outside, on average, not, you know, for a big bird where you want to keep it eating, where you want to keep the core body temperature down, i.e. so that you can, let's say, cool the air such that it's not panting hard after the cooling, and it's actually much happier, and so we've got sensible heat loss, then I think you could get production gains.
Yeah, well, a big example would be the temperatures that we've had, you know, over the last week or two.
They've been
ideal. If you had big birds in that period, you definitely would have had, you know, those birds all sat down and suppressed feeding, you know, because of the fact that, and not just because of the elevated temperatures, but probably also because, well, the combination of elevated temperatures and the fact that your ventilation systems are putting a fair amount of air through the birds as well. So they all decide that they want to sit down, you know, and actually then you could, you know, they don't possibly need all that air over them at the time, and backing it off a bit and being able to drop the temperature could achieve what, you know, what those birds need at that time. So, but like I say, it's not, to us, it's not the answer to a hot and humid day in this country. So,
but yeah, certainly if you said, would you fit one, I would say, yeah, if you want to, go for it. I think it would make,
it's another tool in the armory, basically.
And you might very well, I'd say that to anyone. If you fit a misting system, I think, you know, if you've got a bit of cash you want to sort of write off somewhere, misting systems are fine, you know. But it's not, you have to spec the house correctly if you want to keep them alive in hot weather. That's ultimately it. And there are benefits. For example, you can be in a situation with misting where you can keep that core body temperature nice and low, you know, for a lot longer during the day, but you find you have to switch off later in the afternoon perhaps. But because that core body temperature is low, because that bird is less stressed, it then copes with the really hot weather. If you give
because we find sometimes with our ventilation systems, with the, you know, you're always going for this sort of high airspeed up the ceiling in normal conditions to keep cold air off birds, obviously. And then when you get into the warmer days, sometimes we find actually, you know, that you don't want the extreme of going up the ceiling or directly over the floor at high speed, and actually opening the inlets and dropping the pressure right down to 15 pascals, for example, and just floating air over the birds at that point, especially when those birds are in the kind of, you know, mid-20s, you know, when they're not fully feathered, those birds, at that time as well. You know,
it's closer to ambient temperature, but not with the airspeed.
Yeah, so actually what I'm saying is directly ventilating the birds, if you like, you know, with the airspeed from the side, but slowing that air down when they're younger birds.
That can work. You have to manage it, but it works quite nicely. That does. Yeah. Yes. All gone quiet.
Yeah.
All good.
Any more questions?
All gone quiet. All gone. Yes. Well, I hope that everyone, you know, some folk enjoyed it or captured something. As I say, the basic thing is this: now broilers and all the classes stock will operate in a similar way. Similar, I would say, not identical. They're similar, but it's the reason why we would specify what we specify. You know, again, if you've been in the house, as you know, you've probably, you know, if you've been around long enough, you'll have experienced heat stress. You wouldn't want to muck around with the specification of the houses. And I say, if the birds are going to get more, you know, if the birds are going to get metabolic, more active, we need to be on top of that as well.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for today. We have recorded this, so we will send you a link to it posted on YouTube, if you don't mind. It won't be so much. It won't be all your guys' faces on there. It'll just be the presentation itself and Justin. So we'll put it up on YouTube and send everybody a link to it. And feel free to distribute it as and when. If you'd like, you know, I don't really you've got our email address. If you'd like to talk about any of these things, you know, after the fact, offline, whenever, more than happy to chat about it then. We've got one a little bit more layer orientated later, I think, haven't we? Yeah, in a couple of weeks. Yeah. But, okay. Well, if you're happy about it all, I'm happy about it all. Thank you very much, then, guys. We'll sign off from here. Excellent. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care, guys. Cheers, guys. All right. Jules. Graham's still working on something else.